Right, good morning, learners. Today we are going to be looking at our next grade 12 poem, which is on page 22 of your poetry pack. The poem is entitled Portrait of a Loaf of Bread by Mbuyiseni Oswald Mtshali. That name gets me every time, it's quite a mouthful. Mr. Mtshali was born in 1940 in KwaZulu-Natal, and he attended Columbia University in the States. How fortunate for him. He is one of a group of poets who are known as the Soweto protest poets. And from that you can already deduce that his poetry was about getting a reaction. He wanted black consciousness. And the aim of that was to draw awareness to the apartheid laws. Now, we have spoken at length about life during apartheid. And you are aware of the humiliation and the demeaning conditions that black South Africans faced by their Caucasian oppressors. Thank God we no longer have to experience that. Mr. Mtshali published an anthology of poetry. It was banned, no surprises there. What's very interesting and unique about his poetry is that it captures the daily life of ordinary people in Soweto. And so it's very simplistic on a superficial level. I'd like to move on to reading the poem and then we will analyze it. Look back to the rolling fields, waving gold-topped wheat stalks mowed by the riper scythe, bundled into sheaves, carted to the mill, and ground into flour, kneaded into mountains of dough to be churned by rollers and spat into pans as red hot as Satan's cauldron, brought to the cafe, warmly wrapped in cellophane by Eat Fresh Bread bakery van, for the waiting cook to slice and toast, to butter and to marmalade, for the food-bedecked breakfast table, whilst the labourer, with fingers caked with wet cement of a builder's scaffold, mauls a hunk and a cold drink, and licks his lips and laughs, man can live on bread alone. I'd like to start our discussion by looking at the title of the poem, Portrait. And I know when you hear the word portrait, you are thinking of the painting, you're thinking of the artwork, you are thinking of the photograph, which is an up-close view, the head and the shoulders. And it's usually a study. And here the portrait is of something as simplistic as a loaf of bread, which graces the homes of the rich as well as the poor. We are going to see that this is an extended metaphor that carries on throughout the poem. In line 1, he says, look back. You can hear that is an instruction that is given. Look back means reflect on the past. Look back to the rolling fields. And it's such a beautiful choice of word, rolling, because you can you can almost envision the movement of the wheat in the wind, maybe the breeze. Look back to the rolling fields, and we get an idea of the vastness of the fields stretching onto the horizon. Look back to the rolling fields, waving gold-topped wheat stalks. Look at that personification in line 2. Gold-topped, ready for harvest. And then we have from line 3 all the way to line 8, we have a list of verbs. They are all past tense verbs, and they are more specifically showing us the labor intensity of the act of harvesting the wheat and the process of baking bread. He says in line 3, mowed, cut down by the reaper's scythe, bundled into sheaves, gathered into large bundles, carted, transported to the mill, and ground into flour. And so what we see here is the actual journey of producing bread. It is a journey which stretches from the field all the way to the table. We have words like mold and flour and dough, which help to convey that process that the wheat undergoes. From line 7 to line 10, we have a shift. And the shift is away from the countryside, away from the idyllic rural setting, and we move into the factory setting. We now see the actual process. And in the factory, it says in line 7, kneaded into mountains of dough. So when we're talking about mountain, you straight away you think of something really, really huge. And so that is telling us that this is large scale. This is industrial. We are thinking of huge containers, of stainless steel drums, just kneading the dough. At the same time, I want you to pay attention to that phrase, mountains of dough. It is hyperbole, and it is referring to what's dough? Lots of money. So the process of bread is going to translate into the sales, into the profitability, into lots of money being made, kneaded into mountains of dough, and to be churned by the rollers. Again, it's quite a laborious process, and spat into pans as red hot as Satan's cauldron. So there we have the simile. And I also want you to note the verbs like churned and spat and kneaded and ground. They even convey the violence of the process. In line 10, he says Satan's cauldron. And this is our first biblical reference. Satan's cauldron suggests that the pans are extremely hot. The factory is probably not the coolest place to be working in. We go to our second stanza, I beg your pardon. And our loaf of bread has now been baked. It is now transported. And I like the way he starts by drawing from his real environment, brought to the cafe, warmly wrapped in cellophane by Eat Fresh Bread Bakery van. Please note the punctuation mark at the end of line 30, and you know the purpose of the semicolon. For the waiting cook. The waiting cook. If this is the context of the apartheid years, clearly it is only the affluent who are able to have a cook. The cook is waiting, ready to prepare the bread. The cook is clearly at the beck and call of the diners. Now look from line 15 and 16 what the cook does for the diners. We have a list of simplistic verbs, which is quite opposite from stanza 1 when we had the labor-intensive verbs. We have to slice, toast, butter, marmalade. I like the way marmalade has been turned into a verb. Slice, toast, butter. And it sounds as if these affluent people are above buttering their own toast. Line 16, and to marmalade. And are these not after all luxuries? Butter, marmalade. For those who may have forgotten, marmalade is of course a jam made from oranges. And so the jam has been turned into a verb. And to marmalade for the food bedecked breakfast table. What a sign, what a symbol of luxury. Food bedecked. Hear the irony of these words. Food bedecked. It is a compound adjective. And bedecked quite literally means it's decorated with the extras, as opposed to just having the simple loaf of bread. You've got butter, you've got jam, and that probably was not in isolation. On the table, we probably had a full English breakfast. We probably had a whole spread of eggs and bacon. You know, the whole endless list. And I think the point that is being made by our writer is that black South Africans could not afford a spread like this during the apartheid years. For them, it was a matter of survival. It was just being able to provide the basics. And that is where the irony comes in line 17, when he speaks of food bedecked breakfast table. How many people were even able to have breakfast? How many only had a cup of coffee, a cup of weak black tea without sugar? How many went to work? How many children went to school without breakfast? And so clearly, stanza 2 speaks of privilege. I would like to go as far as saying it speaks of white privilege. We go to stanza 3, whilst. So on the one hand, we have the food bedecked, and then on the other hand, meanwhile, the laborer. Note, he does not generalize. He says the laborer. And he uses the definite article to give specific reference to the workers. Whilst the laborer, with fingers caked, these fingers are covered in the cement, which shows that he is hungry. He's starving. He cannot wait to eat. He doesn't take the time to wash up. In fact, there is no one to serve the common laborer. And so with fingers covered with wet cement, and line 20 gives us a context of where he is working, up on the scaffold. This is a builder, a laborer. With wet cement a builder's scaffold mauls a hunk. The word maul is a violent word, and it's usually a word that we would use when referring to a predator, the lion mauling his prey. And so the choice of the word maul gives or creates that sense of urgency. He attacks the loaf of bread. And you know what I'm talking about, learners, because you've arrived home from school and you are hungry and you just dive straight in whatever you're finding in that kitchen. And so he is violent with hunger. He mauls a hunk. And I like the word hunk. He doesn't take time to cut a little slice. What does he do? He just breaks a chunk of bread. Very much opposite of stanza 2 when we have the affluent Caucasian table. Evidence of white privilege. Mauls a hunk and a cold drink. A cold drink, most likely water. And licks his lips. Iteration. And licks his lips and laughs. There is enjoyment in that moment of filling his belly. He laughs. Man can live on bread alone. Here we have our second biblical reference. And I think that when he says the words in the last line, there is a sense of mockery, the laughter, the licking of his lips. There is the mockery. Now, when I just want to focus briefly on that last line. It is a twist of the words of Jesus. In Matthew 4, in the New Testament, in Matthew 4 verse 4, it says, man shall not live by bread alone. And our speaker is saying man can live on bread alone. And the idea is, the idea from the New Testament is that people need more than just simple necessities to keep them alive. They need other things. Look, we are creatures with souls. We don't just have our physical bodies to take care of. We need the mental, we need the spiritual, we need those elements. And those are the things which enrich our lives and give meaning. And what he is doing here is that he is twisting those words, and he says that man can live on bread alone, meaning that one can make do with just the basics. And yes, it's ironic, but I don't know, it just makes me feel, it makes me feel quite sad. It makes me feel sad, even though he laughed and he was seemingly enjoying the moment. That life for black South Africans was simply about survival. There were no extras in their lives. And that is what Mr. Mtshali is doing. He wants to create the black conscious reaction. So he gives us this wonderful contrast. And it's all centered around a loaf of bread. On the rich Caucasian table, and in the hand, the wet, dirty hand of the common black laborer. We will discuss this together in our online class. Thank you. Great.